today, joining us here at the Albany Institute of History and Art. My name is Sarah Clough. I'm the Director of Art Programs, and I'm very happy to introduce our partner and presenter, Donald Hyman, as well as our partners, Collaborative Studios, today to come together to bring this program, Conversations on Freedom, to the Albany Institute today. And this program is in a hybrid fashion, so we're very happy to see some faces in the room with us. Those on site, we hope that you'll also have the chance to check out our related exhibition, Romancing the Rails, Train Travels in the 1920s and 30s. And for those who are remotely joining us, the exhibit's also open until February 27th, so there's still time. And the program today relates to this exhibit because it focuses on the New York Central Railroad and tells a number of different stories correlated with the railroad, including those of the porters who served on the New York Central. And this particular program is the debut of a film that was produced by Collaborative Studios and written by Mr. Hyman, and also includes local actresses Amelia Paul and Kim Wafer, and poetry by Penny Meacham, whose books are also available in the gift shop if anybody's interested. And we are also very pleased to be to have Ms. Deborah Brown Johnson in attendance, who will be helping to interview Don to expand the story of the Pullman Porters, the first African American labor union. And this film that we're about to debut is part of a number of different living theatrical historical plays that Mr. Hyman has produced, and we're very happy to have had a couple of them take place here at the Institute. Harlem in Vogue, if anyone wants to check out, is available virtually as well. And we will start by debuting the film, and then once the film has completed, we'll take a few minutes for Mr. Hyman and Ms. Brown Johnson to have a little conversation expanding on the history portrayed within it as well.
Oh, mister, we'll get those chairs for you before it's over. We'll get them. Now, I brought some help with me today.
Driving back to when we was organizing, it was 1932. We wasn't allowed to join an organization. I was an undercover man running between here and Chicago, and I used to carry messages, paper to Chicago, Omaha, and if I'd been caught, I'd been fired and I would have been able to retire. But then...
You were carrying papers for whom now?
For Local 465 dining car. This dining car.
So you were working for the union then?
Well, no, I was working for the Union Pacific.
But you were also helping your organization.
Yes, helping the organization.
Now that's fascinating. Now, were there many people that were doing what you were doing?
Yes, there was.
Okay, were the other brothers aware of what you were doing?
Yes,
Now, did they cover for you or help you out in any way?
Was they covering? Yes,
In what ways?
Well, nothing ever got out. And we always operated between ourselves. And when President Roosevelt was president, when he was elected, he made it a law that we could organize. And when we went on from there.
And then they had the information that you carried back to Chicago. Now, is that where the headquarters are located?
No. The headquarters was in Omaha, Nebraska.
Omaha.
But I was running through Chicago, and there would always be an agent and pick up the literature that I had.
Okay, now what kind of literature?
It was something pertaining to the Union.
I see. These were documents then that were important to the Union.
That's right. That's right.
And I'm sure they didn't just entrust those to anybody, though.
As a matter of fact, no.
I am Rosina Crothers Tucker, and I was born in 1881 in Washington, D.C. My husband, B.J. Tucker, was a Pullman porter. In 1920s, the Pullman Palace Car Company was the nation's largest single employer of black men. Pullman porters formed the first black-led union to be formally recognized by the American Federation of Labor, and eventually led the charge on civil rights. And I became one of the most important women labor and civil rights organizers in American history.
I am A. Philip Randolph. Since there were no black unions at that point, Pullman favored hiring black porters for his passenger railway cars. Soon, Pullman became the largest employer of black men in the U.S., and none of them were unionized. In 1921, I started laying the foundation for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which would be the first black-led union to sign a contract with a major U.S. corporation.
I am Helena Wilson. The road to unionizing the Pullman was rough, rocky, and rugged. Pullman's company had a habit of spying, harassing, and dealing with the union activists. Sleeping car porters faced working conditions and were routinely exploited by management. But even so, working for Pullman was one of the best employment opportunities for black men in those days, and workers were understandably reluctant to stick out their necks. But you know what they say when you're going through hell. Keep going. I realized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters needed women as well as men.
My husband, BJ, was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Mr. Randolph recruited me. I was asked to act as a liaison between Mr. Randolph and the Washington Division of Brotherhood. See, the material was sent to me, and I personally distributed it to the men. See, I kept them schooled on what was going on, because it was detrimental for them to let it be known, even to one another, that they were members, or at least interested in being members of the Brotherhood. You see, the Pullman Company, they didn't suspect me at first. Even though I did union business right under their noses, I acted like I was making social house calls to the other Pullman wives, dropping off cakes and pies and fried chicken. I was bringing food for thought, union literature, and collecting dues all at the same time, all by the way of my handbag. But eventually, they found out, because somebody told them.
Loose lips sink ships.
And some would sink a battleship. The company fired BJ on the spot. But Sister Rosina marched right on down to Union Station in D.C. and got down on their case properly. The regional director asked her, "Why are you taking it up?" But when Sister Rosina got finished laying their behinds out, she ripped him a new one. And need I say, BJ was back on the job the very next day.
In 1925, 6 weeks after the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became official, I founded and became president of the Ladies Auxiliary, also known as the Women's Economic Councils.
I became active with the Ladies Auxiliary. The Women's Economic Councils formed connections with labor unions, black and white, women's and men's, throughout D.C. When the Washington Women's Trade Union League, WTUL, and the National Negro Alliance called for a protest against racial discrimination in the grocers trade, we were there.
Sister Tucker, Sister Wilson, and I remained close friends, and for decades.
You see, We're familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington in 1963. But that was not the first time that we had organized and brought before the government issues of job inequalities and injustices. Anyway, let's just take a listen. June 5th, 1941, Honorable Fiorello H. LaGuardia, Mayor of New York City, City Hall, New York, New York. My dear Mr. Mayor, because the Negro people have not received their just share of jobs in national defense, and our young men have not been integrated into the armed forces of the nations, including the Army, Navy, Air Corps, and Marines, on a basis of equality, some of the Negro leaders have formulated plans and set up the necessary machinery in the various sections of the country for the purpose of mobilizing from then to 50,000 Negroes to march on Washington in the interest of securing jobs and justice in national defense and fair participation and equal integration into the nation's military and naval forces.
This movement has been initiated by the officers of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Urban League, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the Young Men's Christian Association, branch of the Harlem community, the Negro Labor Community of New York, the Elks, and a number of other groups.
A call for the march to take place July 1st is signed by Walter White of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, Reverend William Lloyd Innes of the Presbyterian Church of Harlem, Frank R. Crosswaith, Chairman of the Negro Labor Committee of New York, Lael Lean, Vice President of the American Federation of Teachers, Richard Parrish, President of the Negro College Students of New York, Dr. Rayford Logan, Chairman of the National and State Committee for the Participation of Negroes in National Defense, Henry E. Kraft, Secretary of the 135th Street YMCA, KJ Finley Wilson, Grand Exalted Ruler of the Independent Benevolent Order of Elks of the World, and the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell.
And when Randolph organized the second March on Washington in 1963, he called on Tucker that time as well.
We are gathered here for the longest demonstration in the history of this nation. Let the nation and the world know the meaning of our numbers.
We are not a pressure group. We are not an organization or a group of organizations. We are not a mob.
We are the advanced guard of a massive moral revolution for jobs and freedom. But this civil rights revolution is not confined to the Negro.
Nor is it confined to civil rights, for our white allies know
that they cannot be free,
while we are not free. My friend, my sister, Rosina, she was 82 years old at the time of that march. She died in 1987 at 105 years old, after a century of struggle. She had been a mourner at the funeral of Frederick Douglass and was present when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. After her death, an unfinished autobiography was found in which she wrote, "Today is my day, as
it is your day. And although I live far removed from the time when I was born, I do not feel that my heart should dwell in the past. Oh, it is in the future. And while I live, let not my life be in vain. And when I depart, may there be a remembrance of me and my life, just the way I have lived it."
Each day that came along Each day is my day.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Deborah Brown Johnson, and I'm the president of the Albany branch of the NAACP. And I thank you for the opportunity to have a discussion with Mr. Donald Hyman. But I know many of us know him and have seen his work, but let me just share a little more about him. Donald Hyman is a Brooklynite who now calls Albany home. He has a BS from St. Francis College and an MA in Urban Studies and an MS in Secondary Education from Long Island University. He's currently chairman of the Channel Albany and has produced Albany Tempo Spectrum for 8 seasons, and Capital Region Portraits for Proctor's Open Stage Media. He currently works at Montessori Magnet School in Albany.
Montessori!
Mr. Hyman has performed in venues throughout the Capital Region, including MLK Celebration in Saratoga, Proctor's, The Palace, Eden Cafe, Juneteenth, Schuyler Mansion, Albany Civic Theater, Tang Museum, and many more. He has performed in Fences, Lesson Before Dying, Camp Logan, The Exonerated, Of Mice and Men, and The Full Monty. And he can be seen in the History Channel series, The Revolution. So I present to some and introduce to others, Mr. Donald Hyman.
Thank you, Ms. Brown Johnson. I'm honored to have you here to interview me, and I'd like to start off by thanking everyone for coming out on this cold February day to celebrate with us Black History Month. And I'd love to just right now thank my friend Sarah Clow, Jeremy Clow, Zebulon Schmidt for a wonderful job on this film. Working with him was a treasure. And Ms. Tavis Croft, you may or may not know, that was her office where Rosina Tucker was in. She was kind enough to let us use it, so I have to give you a shout out. I know that Kim Wafer and Amelia Paul are out there listening now, and I wanted to send my 2 sisters, I'm their big brother, they're my 2 little sisters, a shout out and thank them so much because we worked on Zoom to rehearse this. And Kim would set up the Zoom, Amelia would be driving around in her car and stop somewhere and we rehearsed the lines. So what you saw on the screen was a result of those practices on Monday. She's up in Clifton Park, I'm in Albany, and Amelia's driving somewhere around the Capital Region. Okay, but the love affair that went on in terms of what we were trying to do and present was something that was translated very well on the screen. And for me, the labor of love connections, which is what we call this project, goes back to Penny, Meacham, myself, and Amelia Paul being invited to the Martin Luther King celebration in Saratoga. And what you saw in this film was originally called, a piece that I wrote called Overcoming, which was part of Conversations on Freedom, which included poetry. We talked about our grandparents who had were part of the Great Migration, who migrated from the South and the Caribbean, and they're working jobs as domestics or janitors and finally getting into unions. I did a couple of freedom songs. I may or may not sing for you today because I got to sing next week. But it was a raging success. And when we had the railroad exhibit here, and I was reaching out to Miss Clow, this wonderful Miss Clow, and I said, I think I have something you might be interested in. So I gave her a couple of choices. She said, the railroads! The railroads! And I'm like, well, you know, I don't fly anymore. I've taken Amtrak across country several times. So it was great. And when I began to explore and get deeper into this piece of history, and as a history teacher, of course, like we all know about the Pullman Porters and the Union, and we've heard A. Philip Randolph, we connect them with the March on Washington. It got to be really, really interesting to me that I had known so much of this background, and I wanted to use my opportunity with the media, film and stage, to present this to people, because not only are my presentations, I don't call them the entertainment alone, they educate you as well, but they are living historical theatrical documentaries. A lot of the script that you saw, or the dialogue that went on, was based on information that I got. You know, I tweaked it a little bit, like, you know, to give it a little humor, so it wouldn't be, you felt like you were in a lecture in a graduate class, and to make the characters who were real human. But for the most part, I got the information from various sources that I read about, and we're able to give you this story, which takes place from the 1920s, when this began, up until the passing of Rosina Fredericks, who was a very new and dynamic person that I was introduced to. So without me going into a whole diatribe here, I will allow my good friend, Ms. Deborah Brown Johnson, to give me some questions that people in the community might have, and then we can take some from you. And then I might sing. No.
We would welcome that, yes, yes. So let me just ask you the first question, Mr. Hyman. Pullman Porters, because I think you spoke to it a little bit, as an employment position, has both a negative and positive connotation. There always been some concern because of the idea of it being in a service kind of position. But your piece gives us a different perspective. Can you share with us from your research how we should look at the Pullman Porters in terms of the work they have done historically?
I think that they are a part of the American story, the great American story of people who overcame tremendous obstacles to get a victory and to receive their goals, and also to the indomitable spirit of the American worker. When I learned about their plight, I was like, a 40-hour week is normal. Hasn't it always been that way? Sick days and holidays, right? Weekends. And, a little overtime because I want to go to the Caribbean this summer and, you know, polish my tan. But the bottom line, you're laughing. The bottom line was, when I read about these gentlemen, they wound up doing something like 400 hours a month, okay? You figure that's not a 40-hour week, right? And they had to do this is on like about 11,000 miles. And then they didn't get paid for, their job required them to prep the room that they were going to prepare. And then when the people were finished, when the train came into the station, they had to break it down, you know, like breaking the set down and get it ready for the next one. And they didn't get paid for that. And so the original group of people that were asked by Mr. Pullman in his vision to change the railroad from an uncomfortable place where you had to take an overnight train ride and sit rather than have a luxury. He wanted a hotel on wheels, and he created that where we would comfort, but part of his vision included having someone there to serve you. And he felt that newly freed African-American male slaves would be, people in bondage, would be ideal for that, suited for that position. And we have to look at it very much from the lens of that time period in terms of what it would become. It would become, the Pullman Company would become the largest employer of African Americans in this country. At one point, there were 20,000 African American men and women that worked for the Pullman Porter Company. And at its peak, there were 100,000 people a night that rode on the Pullman in those sleeper cars. And they had to, each car had to have a person that would be assigned to it, as well as you have dining car staff. And so the original group of men we need to applaud them because, remember, they were a test case. And my Brooklyn accent, and yeah, they were a generation of men who had come out of an agricultural background, which is what most of the South was. And at the time, in the late 1800s, where it's post-Reconstruction and there's a lot of segregation going on, the opportunity to have a job like being a Pullman porter, where you would travel to New York and Chicago and other cities and meet people, was quite different from working on the farm. And that's what most people, black or white, in the South did, because it was an agricultural region of the United States. So in their taking that step forward, remember, they're a test case. Had that first group of men not been successful in doing what they had to do, with their uniforms had to be ready to go, spotless, their shoes shined and everything, the next group wouldn't have come along. So after about 30 years, the new group that came along, because of that first group who sacrificed and made it through, it was able that you connected the Pullman sleeping car porters with these African American men. It was ideal, and they were part of the success of it. The profits were pretty great on the sleeping cars and the trains. In addition to that, when you look at the time period, once again, when the demand for a union amongst these workers becomes an issue, you're looking at a new generation that's now becoming more urbanized. The Great Migration is in progress. So African American people aren't necessarily bound to the farm and restricted to that. They're living in Detroit and in New York and Chicago and LA and filling up those urban areas. And so they have a new way of looking at life, that you have some type of rights. And at the time when these union men, these Pullman porter men, go to A. Philip Randolph, who has a newspaper called The Messenger. They're familiar with him, to ask him to help them organize their union. It's during the period of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, when the whole idea of changing the image of African Americans from being servants and lacking in literacy is an issue. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zona Hurston, Duke Ellington, in the music, Augusta Savage, with her artwork, they're all trying to show something positive about the African American experience. They're telling people who they are about themselves. So along with this wave comes a stimulus amongst these porters to say that we don't have to do, did I mention that out of 24 hours, 20 hours was spent working? And if they wanted to sleep, they didn't have a section sign like a dormitory. In the smoking car area where people stayed all night sometimes, there was a little sheet that they put up, and they got maybe 4 hours if they could. And so these were horrible working conditions that if you wanted to keep that job and you weren't fit for it, you were out really fast and replaced. There was no such thing as grievances. Getting hurt on the job, little things that led to these people understanding that in America, workers, the labor system was changing, and that workers were demanding rights. And so, if you look at America at that time, we think of the clothing fire in New York City, where all those women and things changed because of that. Outrageous child labor laws with children working in mines. At that time period in America, things are changing. So African Americans also saw themselves as Americans and should be a part of that change. So these men stepping forward, and many of them lost their jobs to get this off the ground. And it wasn't an overnight struggle. They battled for 12 years, from 1925 to 1937, until they could get through. And in reading about it, there's a book called Riding the Rails by Larry Tye, if you're interested more. There's a documentary called Miles of Smiles and the Struggles. which actually Rosina Tucker narrates when she's 100 years old. And there's a movie that I watched to get some research called 10,000 Men Named George, which is a Showtime movie that tells you about the process of the struggle to get where they got to go. And those are some of the things that you could look into that might give you some more insight into this very interesting subject. But for the most part, I go back to that, I think about that first group of African American men who had so much to prove, and if it had not been for them, the next group of men would not have been able to get those jobs. Mm-hmm. So by the time it's passed down from like maybe father to son, cousins, friends, A. Philip Randolph, most people don't know, his brother was a Pullman porter for 2 years in Jackson, Florida, until he migrated to New York. So this Pullman porter in the African American communities has a viable thing, because I was reading, if you wanted a job, the best jobs to get for African Americans, other than the agricultural area, was in the post office or as a Pullman porter. And later on, as you notice, I remember growing up and having cousins whose family were what we call career people in the Navy or the Air Force. And to me, those were the rich people, because they went to Greece, and my cousins lived in Maine and California. So when the armed forces opens up, that's also another area where African Americans are become a very big middle class, because they live in a world and they travel. You know, my cousins, they grow up in Greece, and they come back to Brooklyn. I'm like, do they have pizza in Greece? You know, stuff like that. But thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Mm-hmm. You did. But I think one other piece here that shows up. Well, I have two questions. The first one, when we think about, and Mr. Randolph and Ms. Tucker speak to carrying information, and he speaks to, doing undercover work. And so we think about, the risk that they were in, and the risk that they had taken to become unionized. And could you speak about that a little bit from your research? What does that mean? What did that mean for the full movement?
That was
did?
the thing that caught me most, that the women were very critical into making that organization work, because the men, if they were found out that they were interested in going to the union or they were part of it, they got fired right on the spot. That was the end of the line. So in doing the research and reading it, the thing that I compared it to the most was the Underground Railroad, because they had to form this kind of we exist but we're secret society, and they had to find ways, like, for example, I was reading that if they saw A. Philip Randolph on the street, they couldn't stop and talk to him. They'd have to keep going like they didn't know about it. So it operated under those types of situations. Meanwhile, they had headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, and Chicago, and New York, and Denver, and San Francisco. But the thing that made it important for me to bring out the women's role in this, which I don't think most people are aware of, was, and I'll quote from Riding the Rails, Larry Tye's book, it said, "Wives were critical in sustaining the organization. They collected dues at coffee clutches, visited other wives to disseminate union literature, and stood in for their husbands anywhere there might be a union spy. And it was impossible to discuss the organization's program because you never knew whom you could trust. What had to, and they go on to quote that, we had to function through the women at the time because they could attend meetings, they could pick up literature, they could take literature, they could collect dues. So the role of the women in keeping this organization above water was very critical. So I felt that in showing this in my piece, it was important to know that. It was, what is it, the expression behind every good man is a good
woman.
Oh, look at Miss Johnson. I'm just kidding. Okay.
Yeah. Well, another question here, and a significant piece I thought in the film was the letter. and the featuring of that letter. And it also, it just depicted labor and community collaboration and how they all worked together to create the kind of change that needed to happen. Could you talk about that a little bit and bring it forward? Because your most recent piece, Be All Right, that we shared at the MLK program, spoke to folks who had participated in labor and community organizations activities to look at employment, housing, living situations across this country. And here we're looking at this particular time, there's still that kind of collaboration. And how did that work to address what was described here in your piece, a moral movement to make change?
It kind of goes back to A. Philip Randolph's vision, of being able to organize for social action as well as for economic action. And he saw this in the sense that if you're an American and you're a full citizen, then you're entitled to all of those rights. And so part of what we're working for is to make sure that you get that. And the other thing that he did that was interesting is most people in their protests went to like the senators or the congressmen, and their issues got shot down. He went straight to the top, to the executive board, not to the legislative, and it was or the judicial. He went straight to the executive, and he set the precedence for that. Going to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then to Harry Truman when it came to. Did you know he was responsible for helping us to desegregate the armed forces? A. Philip Randolph is my man from now on. He first black vice president of the AFL-CIO in 1957 through 1968. You couldn't even sit down at a lunch counter and get a cup of coffee, and he was able to pull that off. So let's give him his kudos. Moving back to your question. Hello. That particular, as a social studies teacher, when I taught at American Studies Department at St. Rose, primary documents are very important. And in doing research for the film and learning about Randolph, when I found that particular letter, which is a primary document, and thank you, Zeb Schmidt, for using it the way you did in the editing, because it gives this piece more of we're almost like looking at the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or some important document. And when I found it, you could tell it was one of those old typewriters that typed it. And what really got me was the mentioning of the names of the different people who supported this particular march that they were going to do in 1941. And it mentioned people in education, in church organizations, Elks, the Y, and I was like flabbergasted because most people don't think of African American communities being organized to that sophisticated level at that particular time, and it was important to me to include the names of those people and what their organizations were, because from a historical point of view, if you saw that, then you see that the struggle that people in the 60s didn't just happen overnight in the 60s. The people had been on that road for a long, long time, making progress, slow progress, but nonetheless progress. And whether, as Dr. King once said, don't worry about the staircase, worry about the step. They have been taking these steps to move forward and join together and overcoming overwhelming sometimes obstacles. I think that when you mentioned that these men decided that they wanted to have a union, form the union, the Pullman company wasn't just saying, oh, that's wonderful, you're going to have a union, let's have a party. Oh, they came at them hard. They paid black newspapers to say negative things about them. They paid off churches to try to discourage people to get involved with it. It was an all-out campaign war. And at some points, if these people who wanted to do what they eventually were going to do had been weak-minded or weak-spirited, they would have never gone forward. And if they had been the type that could have been corrupted, they would have never gone through. But to their credibility, it's one thing to say you're going to do something, and it's another thing to do it when you lose your job and you got a family, and it's the depression, and you still hold on to what you believe in. And Ava Randolph's wife, who was part of Madam C.J. Walker's beauty school and had a beauty parlor in Harlem where she served the elite, had it not been for his wife having that beauty parlor, he wouldn't have had a roof over his head. So there's another form of where the women helped out in terms of making it work. They made it work. So those collaborations and people that went forward to make change, we have to respect that, because you're looking at a time when segregation and Jim Crow in the North, in places like New York and Chicago, is rampant, and it's also very prevalent in the South. And I think it was Fannie Lou Hamer who said the difference between racism in the North and the South was that in the South they would shoot you in your face, and in the North they shoot you in your back. So you're talking about the lesser of two evils, and people willing to go forward to make a change, and that change not happening overnight. But, and I'm going to default a little bit. When President Obama got elected, I was at Albany High School in the library with other people, and there was a TV, and we were watching it. And it hadn't got to me that this was happening until Aretha Franklin came on with her little hat with the bow on the side and was singing the national anthem. And tears began to run down my eyes, because my grandparents, who migrated to New York from the South and worked very hard down there, and then came to New York and were able to get into unions, in their lifetime, they never got to see a black president. In some cases, they didn't believe, people made them believe that it could never happen. But I realized my one purpose in this life was to be able to witness that for them. They had sacrificed for me to go to school, to have a roof over my head, to have clothes. And here I was, a teacher standing in the library at Albany High School and watching this person become president. And I realized my purpose was to be there to witness that for them. So these people that were doing the union stuff and the civil rights movement, they were looking that their children don't have to do that. And I think that will apply to all groups of Americans across the country who migrated here, immigrated here, that their children were the American dream. And so let's connect with that and see how the change doesn't come overnight, but the change will come, okay?
We just
one day at a time.
Moving forward.
I'm scared of you.
That's what I said. Thank you, Mr. Hyman. I know we want to take a moment to ask questions from the audience as well, or you want to?
Yeah, no. I have to share this with everybody. How you doing out there? Okay.
Very good.
Okay. Penny Meacham and myself, who she's in Asheville, North Carolina, listening, we were privileged to be invited to go to the New York Writers Institute to see Nikki Giovanni. And we met her and we took photos with her, and she was very inspiring. But I found one of her poems, and I didn't realize she'd written a poem for the Pullman Porters. So I'll do an excerpt of it, and then I'll do part of Penny's piece, Heart, Soul, Shoes. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, the poem is called Rosa Parks, but I just stick to the Pullman Porters part. This is for the Pullman Porters who organized when people said they couldn't, and carried the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender to the black Americans in the South so they would know they were not alone. This is for the Pullman Porters who helped Thurgood Marshall go south and come back north to fight to fight the fight that resulted in Brown versus the Board of Education, because even though, ... it was the Pullman porters who whispered to the traveling men, both bluesmen and racemen, so that they both would know what was going on. This is for the Pullman porters as if they were happy when the Supreme Court announced its 9-0 decision that separate is inherently equal. And by the way, Thurgood Marshall, Malcolm X, and a few other people, I can't think of offhand, were Pullman porters. It was a good job. Hard sole shoes. In our original Conversations in Freedom at Cafe Lena that was held 2 years ago, we celebrated African American men workers and women's workers. I believe this particular piece, it reaches out to the African American labor. Reminds me of my grandfather, my uncles, as they were. It's called Heart, Soul, Shoes, and a poem for Uncle Willie by Penny Meacham. And she gave me permission to read this yesterday. Thank you, Penny. He wore hard-soled shoes, or work boots, not really the sneakers and sweats kind. Grew up on a farm, knew hard work, so paid it no mind, up before dawn's crack. Truly the man working try-jobs before workaholic was a thought. Wore a sheriff's uniform like nobody's business, but he loved trucks. Milk truck, bus driver, 18-wheeler, and even trucking other folks' crap. He just loved to ride. No thanks, cesspool pumping. We wore our sugar honey iced tea with pride. I corrected that. Because he loved to mow the lawn and trim the hedges, grew roses along the side of our home, would be in night clothes, and at sundown, even in winter, might manage a 5 minutes to sit with us to watch TV before he was snoring. No matter, Santa waited a couple of days sometimes till he came home from third shift, and it was okay because we were Christmas, because we had 7-course dinners, and every night he was the head of our table, grinning, cat and dog licking their chops too. Always heat tanks filled and storm windows for us, and sometimes we'd snack during sports shows, and he surprised us with long road trips. He'd let me paint the house with him and use the big rider mower just because I was his son, and he would take me out to drive his caddy, even though I was really bad, and it's still others might see his beat-up country truck and think, bumpkin, as they BMW drive by, but he in his silence would be like, so what? See if I can. As you pass on by, you can't see our paradise right in front of your eyes. He lived and died a Southern black man doing just fine. Told you I was going to sing. Like a branch on a tree, I keep reaching to be free. Moving on, moving on. There's a place in the sun, and before my life is done, gotta find me a place in the sun. Was that a G? Did I hit that note? Oh, okay. Now we can have some questions and answers. Where are my peeps at? Okay. This lady's hand went up first.
Hi, I'm Randy Bentley, and I wondered if you would care to take your whole program to Hildene. It's
To
in
where?
Manchester, Vermont. Hildene, it's in Manchester, Vermont, and Mr. Pullman and Robert Todd Lincoln were partners in the Pullman train.
Yes.
And they have a reel that they spent thousands of dollars on. They found it in Savannah, and they beautifully restored a real Pullman car.
Oh, my God.
They would love to have you two do your thing up there. And now's a good month to try because they always do a special thing for Abraham's birthday, Lincoln. I hope you do it.
I love your offer. It sounds wonderful. Keep Hollywood. Did you hear that? I'll have to let you talk to my agent over there, Miss Chloe.
Okay.
Okay.
Because I've been in the Pullman car twice. It is a magnificent thing.
Is it really?
It's the only one that's ever been restored in the whole country.
Is it really that fierce?
Is it really that?
Fierce. Nice.
Fierce.
Oh, it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous.
You know, they say that
They found it in Savannah.
African Americans couldn't ride those during that time period, but Duke Ellington in all his glory, he would rent 3 or 4 of them, and the band played on. If you saw that, there's a video of them doing "Take the A Train."
No.
They're on one of the Pullman porters doing that, and it's a funny thing I was reading because my good friend, my favorite one of my favorite actors, Sidney Poitier, passed, and it was that somebody wrote that the Pullman porter's been in more movies than Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier. If you see so many Hollywood movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and there's a train scene, these gentlemen would be there present. So they're part of the American landscape. Thank you very much. Next question. This lady in green.
Thank you. My question is, I know there was the Pullman strike at the end of the 1800s.
Yes.
That was very violently put down.
Mm-hmm.
Were the Pullman porters involved in that strike, or was that just like the Pullman factory workers?
That was, from what I read, it was in Chicago, and Pullman had built this like city. Are you familiar with Milton Hershey, the guy that makes Hershey?
Yeah.
He has that Hershey, PA is like Milton Hershey's town, and the workers lived there. So Pullman has something similar to that. But no, they weren't involved in that. And people got killed with that one, and they brought people in. But interestingly enough, Milton Webster, who was the Chicago representative for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, he was a child. He remembers seeing that. And later on, when he becomes very important to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, you know, he referred back to that. Chicago, even now, is the hub of the trains. You know, all the trains you want to go in this country, you go to Chicago to get it. I don't fly no more. I hit a storm coming out of the Caribbean. I knew it was time for me to go back up there. And I've been traveling across country several times. America is a beautiful country, and you got to see it by train. But when you get to Chicago, and you get them double-deckers, and you go to that the relaxation car where all the cars face out the window, and it's plexiglass, and you're going through the mountains, and Puget Sound, and hey, Rocky Mountains, I love it. I think I might go this year, but I got to wear a mask though, right? Thank you. Next question. Why don't we move on down? Yes.
So thank you very much for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much for coming.
Well, I'm glad I did. One question has to do with the danger that the Pullman porters face in the north and in the south, wherever the trains went. It was a time of the Ku Klux Klan, all kinds of violence, and they were doing something that perhaps rankled those people. So I wonder what kind of danger they were in. And my other question is whether they, in their effort to establish a union, whether they collaborated with white workers.
I will try to answer your question the best way I can. During that time period, they used to call it the tunnel ride when you went across the Mason-Dixon line, because they said they were not sure whether or not the people that they were working for were going to get, well, they could be insulting, but that they explained all over they got called George or boy, all right? And that was another one of their grievances when they got the union. They wanted that changed, that they would have name tags or have their name put on the section that they would call. They really had a problem with that. But yeah, a lot of times it was dangerous. There were people that were dragged off and beaten and lynched. in the South, and there were people that, even in the North, I read another book called Blacks in the Adirondacks, where a gentleman was accused of a lady inviting him, to come by and have a couple to talk, to chat, and then she changed her mind. But the bottom line was he was put in a situation where he was about to lose his job, and the union came forward, and then it was very precarious, and you walked the thin line. But then how can I put this? If you compare that to any hospitality, like you work in a restaurant. Today we have, which is good, sexual discrimination. You say something nasty to a woman and you work somewhere in a workplace. We have all those things in place. It took a long time for them to come. These gentlemen had to put up with that too. But remember, they had to put up with it when they were on the train, and they had to put up with it when they were off the train. Does it make sense? Mm-hmm. At the time we're talking about, African Americans were a second-class citizen in America, North and South. Does it make sense? When they went to the AFL, they did partner with whites. And when they were trying to garner support, there were white groups, church groups, all kinds that they reached out to that would give them donations because they were trying to form a union. So they recognized that people would support you based upon what your cause was.
Combination.
Yeah, a combination of that. And so I think that's where it went. But in terms of the hierarchy of the way the Pullman set it up, it's interesting how the military was similar to this too. You had all black armies before they integrated, and you'd have a white lieutenant in charge of them. And you'd have all these Pullman porters and a conductor who was white in charge of them. And a black Pullman porters could never rise to a conductor status. Does that make sense? All right. So that in itself led to a lot. And a lot of the factory workers that made the cars in Chicago, Pullman didn't consider hiring blacks for that too. Later on it became. I went to Chicago yesterday. Did I tell y'all? Chicago. Virtually I did. I reached out. You're laughing at me over there. You want to answer the question then. I reached out to there's a Pullman museum, A. Philip Randolph Museum in Chicago, and I reached out to them at the beginning of trying to get some research, and I wanted to get like a Pullman t-shirt or a little hat or something. They're not doing merchandise because of COVID, and they're closed because of COVID, but they have a virtual tour. So yesterday was a snow day. Can you believe it? I wonder why yesterday was a snow day. And I went to Chicago. I did the virtual tour, and it doesn't take that long, but it takes you through and tells you the story, And if I go to Chi-Town, I've been to Chi-Town, that's somewhere I would probably visit too the next time I go there. So I hope I answered your question? What, you didn't introduce yourself?
The second question had to do with collaborating with non-Africans.
I said yes, that they did do that.
You did?
They did do that. Remember, they go to the AFL to be accepted, and that wasn't necessarily a black group at that time. This gentleman, Miss Chris Croft, didn't you have your hand up?
Yes.
Ladies first, I'm sorry.
So my question is about women. I know that...
No, it is. No, just kidding.
I know that both men and women work for the Pullman company.
Yes.
And I know there are a lot of women who supported the Pullman company perhaps through their husbands. But what were the jobs that the women had working for the Pullman company?
I thought you'd never ask. Well, it was more like being a maid. And so, like people that would have children, or they also did hair, that type of thing. It was more like maid type of work. And there were a sizable number of women, and they were affected by the union too. And part of what Rosina and the other ladies were representing with them also in their plight. However, as quiet as it's kept, as the men got the union and moved forward, the leadership with the women's eventually folded when they got, I think, like 50, don't quote me, early 50s, okay? Then you got to remember two things that happened. People aren't doing rails as much when airlines become more popular, right? They're traveling faster. Does that make sense? And remember, you're building these nice highways during the Depression. So a lot more people have cars now, so they're traveling that way. So they begin to see a decline in people wanting to take those. I had an aunt who was visiting my cousin in San Diego because she was a Navy lifer. She's the first person I know went across country on a train, on a sleeper, and she would tell us about it. See, it was those types of stories that made me want to, I'm an Air Force veteran, want to join the military. You know, that you could see the world other than just Brooklyn, you know? And when I got my chance, of course, I went. And here I am. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I can get you some more information on that.
Yeah, I was just, yeah.
No,
I
they
can look that up, but what I was thinking about your presentation.
they were included in that struggle. Yes. Your name, sir?
Jacob.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the presentation and developing how the unions and the working class leadership to fight for the Pullman union influenced the civil rights movement. And one chapter that I thought you might be able to speak a little more to, there were leaders of the Pullman Porters Union were directly involved in leading the Montgomery bus boycott.
Mr. Mays.
And E.D. Nixon.
I'm sorry. Right.
And E.D. Nixon and I believe other associates of his were involved in that. And, you know, the character of putting that together and what you raised about, you know, the meetings and the collections appealing for support and all the things that they had to do, it seems to me it helped lay the basis for that very influential historical struggle that helped break open the broader civil rights movement. So I wanted to speak a little bit to that.
Okay, and of course, there are even when you get to the civil rights in the 60s, there are collaborations amongst groups like SNCC and SCLC, you know, for Freedom Summer, Council of Churches. They all become allies in trying to change these things. And so with the march, the Montgomery bus boycott, you realize that Rosa Parks was involved with the NAACP.
Yes.
Who's the president of the NAACP in Albany? Okay. So these groups were active. And remember, they had publications like Crisis Magazine and The Messenger. And, probably you wouldn't get it. Probably I wouldn't get it either. But in that poem about the Pullman Porters, the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, as well as the Amsterdam News, were very big African American newspapers. And in the South, back to what you were talking about, they didn't want those kind of papers distributed to black people. And who do you think it was that brought them? The Pullman Porters, okay? They had people that they would meet in those areas that they would give the papers to. Now, back to last year's presentation, because I think Patrick is out there somewhere. We did a program about, in Harlem, Black Swan, which was the first African-American record company based in Harlem. The way they got their records distributed, and I do remember this, is they would give their records to who? The Pullman Porters, because they were going to different parts, Atlanta and Mississippi and these other kind of places, and they would take their records, and somebody there would meet them. You know, of course, they got a nice little cut out of it, but the point was, there was this network. So in doing my research, also, they mentioned that it's because of the Pullman Porters that they sort of had a hand in the Great Migration, in the sense that those papers, like the Chicago Defender or the Amsterdam, when African Americans saw them, they got information about where there were jobs available in Detroit or Chicago. So they knew where they were going to, because if you ever study the Great Migration, it wasn't, I'm just going there because I want to see what Chicago looks like, you know. They had a specific place to go. They knew that they were going to get a job. They knew where they were going to stay. And there was support from their church groups and family there. And later on, the community grows. And as an urban studies major, I found out most of Americans, like especially in New York City, you have that type of thing happening too, where people come from Europe and they're on the Lower East Side, and they have friends and family that are coming over. They have their networks set up, you know, to support them. Their synagogues and churches, it's, you know, to help people get jobs and have a place to stay. And then when I was in New Orleans, they have their mutual aid societies. Because remember, we're looking at a time where Social Security doesn't exist. It doesn't exist until the Depression. So people within their own groups and families have to find a way. In New Orleans, I always wanted to wonder why are people dancing when somebody passes away. And when I went to New Orleans and they gave us a tour, they explained that that person is a member of this particular mutual aid society. They pay their dues, and when they pass away, the president and the officers go to the family's house, they pay for the funeral, and they have a first line, second line, and third line, immediate family, friends, associates, and they march together to celebrate this person's life. And so when learning about the culture and how people had to find ways to survive, you know, those organizations still survive today, but they have their roots back there. When I studied the Lower East Side, and I went to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, they had mutual aid societies where they would help each other out, you know? So we're looking at something that's universal in terms of people and how we got where we got. You know, it didn't happen overnight. Back to that again. I got to write a book called It Didn't Happen Overnight. Okay, next question. Let me get this gentleman here.
Almost a follow-up on that question. How the Pullman strike led to the civil rights marches. What preceded the Pullman strike that might not be as prominent as we know that set the groundwork for that?
You talking about the Pullman porters or the? Yeah. In 1925 when they
What other African American movements were crushed, failed, but yet led to the success of that one?
There are so many. There are so many. How far back do you want to go? Okay. Okay.
What is the level that gave them obviously the power in numbers?
Okay, because of the fact that this agency wanted to employ African American men, and it had 20,000 men with regular jobs. That helped a lot, and the fact that they were mobile. You know, they knew what Chicago, New York, and LA looked like. They weren't. In other words, let me use a cliche. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they seen Gay Parade, right? So these gentlemen were worldly in terms of knowing you didn't have to take just anything that was better. In relationship to your question, there were several movements. There was a movement to colonize Africans and send them back to Africa, okay? And Richard Allen, who started the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, I had a wonderful time last week going on YouTube learning about a place called Samana in the Dominican Republic. I'd heard about it years ago, where about 6,000 African-American freedmen were negotiated with Boyer, who was the minister of Haiti, that at that time owned all of Hispaniola, which is Dominican Republic and Haiti. They welcomed these people into the island, and they stayed in this one particular section. Very organized, and they had a coin where they showed that if you didn't like it, you could come back. Many of them stayed, they built houses. Many of them had trades, and what was more interesting than anything else to me was the fact that a lot of them were shipbuilders out of the Philadelphia area. They actually built their own ships sail ships that they brought people down in. So when they got to the Dominican Republic, they were able to in their trades, they were able to build boats, and they were able to to trade their products that they grew around the island. So there are lots. There's Blanche K. Bruce, who was a senator from Mississippi, who went on to do great things. Of course, you know about Mr. Douglas. Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee Institute still lives today. It almost failed. It was an old abandoned plantation. He used to come to New York, especially to Saratoga, to meet people to get money for the school. When he died, he got sick in New York on a mission trip to try to raise money from rich people. And but when he died in 16, something like that, he literally had raised $1 million in donations from various people for his school, which actually continues to go on today with the help of another gentleman who was the only African American agricultural professor in the country at that time, a gentleman by the name of George Washington Carver, who I did a little thing for the schools on. I'm George Washington Carver because when I was a little boy doing a report on George Washington Carver, my grandmother comes up to me. My grandmother's from North Carolina, and she says, when I was a little girl, he came to our school and talked to us. And I'm like, yeah, right, And I didn't understand the significance of my grandmother having George Washington Carver come to her school and talk to them. But the man that invented 300 different uses for the peanut and like 100 for sweet potatoes, and saved the South with crop rotation when they were being boll weevilled out, increasing black farmers from like 150 in Alabama to maybe 500 in a couple of years. And the problem was he suggested they use sweet potatoes and peanuts to rotate the crop so to put nutrients back into it. Then they said, what are we going to do with all these peanuts? What are we going to do with all these potatoes? He said, peanut butter. Does that answer your question?
Good, John.
Anybody else? Next? Okay, let me see. Who?
So I just wondered, whatever happened to the Pullman porters? What's happened to that?
I thought you never asked. Remember, as I said, the decline in business with the sleepers, they sort of disbanded about 69, if I'm not mistaken. I don't even think there are any left alive today. I may be wrong. There might be one or two. That documentary, Miles of Smiles, Years of Struggle, is about a reunion of a bunch of Pullman porters, because just like transit workers or policemen, they would have their halls where they would have annual meetings for the retirees. They go hang out. But the thing that, back to what you were talking about, is they kind of merged with another union, and as they became part of Amtrak. So the people that I met when I went to Tucson, Arizona, who waited on me and served me, and of course I know I was paying them, when I lost my Citibank card in Tucson running in and out of thrift shops. Tucson is the thrift shop heaven of the world. And they would mail stuff for you. So I was mailing rugs and leather coats, whatever, Mexican rugs, And I knew I had my check, because I worked for the federal court system, was coming up while I was going to be on vacation, and couldn't find my card to get my direct deposit. And the guy that went from New York to Chicago, from Chicago to New York, to Tucson with me, was on the train and remembered me. And I told him I don't have any cash. I just have like $20. I got my credit card. He told me, go ahead, get whatever you want, and when you get off, give me a good tip. 2 days later, when we got to Chicago and they had my Citibank card for him, I made sure that he'd get dinner for him, his girlfriend, and maybe his kids. But that is what you would still have porters on the train and dining cars, but they're kind of connected now with the Amtrak. So that particular union is now historical in its sense. And most of those original members, of course, have passed on. Next question. I'm sorry, ma'am. And do we have anybody online?
No, online we have a lot of friendly messages from Amelia Paul, Kim Weaver, who were in the film, as well as Penny Meacham saying
Okay,
hi,
all right, okay, good.
that they're so pleased to have this happening.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I really appreciated your
talk and you're singing.
I can sing some more if you want. Actually, here's a plug. Next Sunday at, is it 2 o'clock again? Yeah, 2 o'clock is on Sunday at Beat the Winter Concert Series. This is my 3rd year. I'm doing the Valentine's show. It's called Very Truly Yours, the Valentine's show. I have a pink suit, I have a red suit, Valentine color, I have a white suit, and then I'm doing a little mini Temptation thing because I went to see Ain't Too Proud to Brag on Broadway. I've got sunshine. No.
Where is this?
Next Sunday, 2 o'clock.
Here?
No, Schenectady Library, Beat the Winter Concert Series. Okay? That was a plug.
Okay.
And you're coming, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'll wear pink. So really help me appreciate the role of the Pullman porters more in the history of both the labor movement and the civil rights movement in a broader fashion. The thing about E.D. Nixon in the Montgomery bus boycott really kind of exemplifies this. E.D. Nixon was also the president of the NAACP and had been the president of the Pullman Porters local in his area. And he worked with he was, very active in the union. And that really gave him the organization. You described how they organized. So he'd come out of all that, And so he's the one that worked with Rosa Parks. And he's the one that got the preachers. They didn't jump right out. In fact, in a speech he gave 10 years after the bus boycott, he talked about how he called a range of them, and none of them said yes at first. And he called them all back and said, okay, fine. If you don't say yes, we're going to have a mass meeting, which had already been called. And I'm going to tell them all, you were too chicken to do this. So King came forward, and others. But he was really the mastermind behind this, and I really think he drew on his Pullman Porter
experience.
Organizing. And on the question of labor in general, the AFL was really a segregated, structure. And the blacks and unions didn't really come into being until the AFL, the CIO was founded. When black and white were in the mines in the South, in auto in Detroit, in steel in Chicago, where blacks were able to, for a number of reasons, get into those jobs. And then for the unions to win, they had to have the blacks involvement, the black workers. So in that Pullman Porter, I think Pullman Porters all leads up to that. I mean, it's a fascinating history.
It really is. And what we were talking, one of the courses that I taught was about the Motown. And my students each got a pink slip with the name of the Temptations or the Supremes or the Four Tops on it. And then we learned about Detroit. Why was Detroit? Because of the oils and everything. But the fact that most of these people, like the Supremes and the Temptations, their families all migrated from the South to Detroit to work. And I would say at least 80% of them worked in the automobile industry to some degree. And why was that? And then we found out that Henry Ford actively recruited African-American men to work in the automobile industry, which, in fact, the town of Inkster, most of you heard, Please, Mr. Postman? Open, Mr. Postman, look and see. The Marvelettes come from Inkster, Michigan, and that was a town that was set up because people in that part of Michigan, where one of Ford's plants were, didn't want blacks living there. So they bought some land and set up like a model city called Inkster, Michigan, and those families that were able to work for Ford, and they went in and set up hospitals and schools during the Depression to save the town. But the fact that in Detroit there were a couple of ministers that if you came to Detroit in the 30s and 20s and you wanted to get a job with Ford, you went through this minister. That's a theater piece I'd like to do a piece on, because he was able to, if they came to him, they got the job. And his name on it, you got a job with working there. But the jobs that they gave black workers at Ford were limited. Like a lot of them had to go to the foundry. and hard jobs. And then one of the things I learned was when they decided to start the union, the black group was one of the hardest one they had because they had this loyalty to Ford. And they didn't want to feel like they were, until somebody explained to them it would be all right. But another thing about the Pullman Porter jobs, which she asked in the beginning, I had a French friend of mine tell me that there are no stupid jobs. He told me this in French. There are no stupid jobs, there's only stupid people. Because if you work, you're going to get paid. Okay? And then I had an Italian friend of mine tell me, work harder, but work smarter. All right? And I had an African American friend of mine tell me, you got to get the getting when the getting's good. Okay? So the bottom line is, I really think about my aunts and my uncles and my grandparents from the South and working. And my grandmother worked at Doctor's Hospital, and they didn't say maids anymore, they said housekeeping department. But she was in Local 1199, the union, and she became the union rep. And she would come in the house on Sundays with stories about Shelley, the actress, Shelley Winters being there, or Sidney Poitier's wife had the baby there. And this is like right down the street from Gracie Mansion. And she got this job because her best friend from down south was working there. She called her up and told her they needed somebody else. My grandfather was in the Army, and he, when I can be a little kid, I remember in North Carolina, his trucks being outside. He was a long-distance truck hauler, log hauler from one state to the other. There was no union for that. He drove trucks in the Army, so he got the job driving trucks. And it was segregated. And when he came to New York, he was able to get a job working for a condo as a co-op downtown Brooklyn where Jacob Lawrence lived. He was the only black that lived in there, the artist. And he later went on to work at Borough Manhattan Community College where he became supervisor, and they didn't call it janitors anymore. They called it maintenance engineers. But both of them got into unions, they retired, and they got pensions. Had they remained in the South, none of that would have happened for them. And so when I was a teacher in New York and I became a member of the United Federation of Teachers, I jumped for joy, because this is what they wanted to see us do. They sacrificed and cleaned, washed out this, that, threw out garbage and everything, so that one day I wouldn't have to do that. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with having to clean out, take out garbage and do everything. In fact, New York City sanitation men make more than teachers. But the bottom line is this, okay? If you're relegated to that, if you're limited to that, if you're not allowed to get in, it's one thing to be able to do that. There's dignity in that, right? You pay your bills, you pay your house, you do what you have to do. But when that's only the kind of job that you could get because of who you are, then you want to see that change, okay? Sleep-in jobs. In 1969, African-American women in all of the United States were able to be live-in maids overnight, take care of the kids, do the cooking. That was a lot of them got to the North. And there was no union for that. In fact, you go to Harlem. How many heard of Harlem? I did say Harlem, not Harvard. There is a difference. Thursday nights was called Maid's Night. At all of the big dance places in the 40s, they called it Maid's Night because most of the maids that lived in Long Island and Brooklyn and Queens and Westchester, that was their night off because on the weekends they had to cook and clean and work and everything like that. So they would get all dressed up and meet. I think there's a movie about that too. But a friend of mine from Harlem, he said that's when they would go because they figured they could meet them a country girl. No, I'm just kidding. Any more questions?
I just was reading through the comments and in response to one of the earlier topics that came up about the Pullman Company. Amelia Paul wrote that in 1969 the Pullman Company dissolved. That was the timeline. But it is about 3:30, so it's
oh really?
A good amount of
no,
time.
say it isn't so. Say it isn't so.
We're very grateful for the discussion, but we might want to start to wrap
wind it down. Okay,
I'm
gonna wind it down like this. First of all, thank you all for coming out in this weather to support this particular project, and I'm glad, I really am honored that you're here. Sarah, a million thanks. Zeb over there, this is a genius, and genius loves company. Where is Jeremy? Jeremy's somewhere around here. Oh, there he is. Thank you again. Listen, we spent the whole day here in the museum just to do that little 15-minute scene that you saw, the whole day. And you know me, I was the one dealing with the costumes, okay? Because I went to Parsons School of Design. Don't tell nobody, but I made sure everybody was wearing, let me stop. Ms. Deborah Brown Johnson, the wonderful president of the NAACP, thank you so much for attending and coming out of your busy schedule to do this today. Mallory over here, we just met. Thank you so much for your help and support on this project. Ms. Miss Croft, not only did we use your office, but we filmed in it too, okay? In fact, is it for rent? I may want to have a party there. Let me stop. Thank you for your help and support over the years. You've been wonderful to me. And Penny, hi. Amelia, you know I love Amelia. Boy, when you're riding around, I know you're riding around in your taxi right now. And Kim, I know you're up there somewhere saying, "Oh no, you didn't." Hey, smart lady, yes I did. Okay. So all of you, and wishing you adieu and thank you. This is Black History Month, and I go back to being a child in Brooklyn when it was Negro History Day. Then it became Negro History Week. Then it became Black History Week. Now it's Black History Month. And so I ask you to remember that Black history is American history. When you talk about Pullman porters, you talk about part of the great American dream. Okay? And some of these guys had happy stories too. They talked about wanting to work when Jackie Gleason would take his train rent the whole train and take it from LA to Miami to do the Away We Go or How Sweet It Is. He would give all of the Pullman porters $100 tip. You know what $100 was like in like 1962? Guess what? My grandmother would call out the window. We played touch football. She'd say, "Donna, want you to go to the store and bring me back a pack of cigarettes, a loaf of bread, and a quart of milk. Here's $1." And then she would add, "And bring me back my change." And that's what $1 could do, because imagine what $100 could do back in those days. So these gentlemen, for what it's worth, they paid, this is an old African-American expression from musicians in Harlem. They paid their dues, okay? And that first group that went through, that was the test group, had it not been for them, there would have not been the other gentlemen. People said, "Oh, they're rude, they're callous." They had high standards to do. The only problem was, and this was the problem with a lot of people who had good businesses and companies, is the exploitation of workers. They didn't see that you have to take care of these people too, and you're not going to go broke, you know? But what can I tell you? They fought They fought the good fight. And guess what? They won. I'm out of here. Peace and chicken.